Senate Republicans passed President Trump's $9 billion rescissions package. This will help restore fiscal sanity in our country by rescinding billions in wasteful foreign aid and finally ending taxpayer funding for PBS and NPR, two media organizations that have ridiculously used federal dollars to push a partisan left-wing agenda for many years.
You know, if you still somehow need to be convinced that Donald Trump and the Republican Party feel nothing but disdain and shame toward the most marginalized groups of people in the country, look no further than how Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt is celebrating her party gutting funding to PBS and NPR.
I want to give you a chance to respond to the CEO of NPR. She's claiming that the cuts to their network will, quote, be a real risk to public safety of the country. Congressman Murkowski has argued that public broadcasting stations save lives. Could you respond to these concerns?
The NPR CEO said cutting NPR will be a risk to public safety. I am not sure how NPR helps the public safety of our country, but I do know that NPR, unfortunately, has become really just a propaganda voice for the left.
If NPR has any biases, it's not towards the actual American left, but rather the centrist establishment of both political parties that want to keep things running like they always have been. Of course, that doesn't jive with MAGA's authoritarian ambitions, nor with the left's calls for critically examining society and changing government to meet the needs of today and the future. But to MAGA, any narrative or piece of news that doesn't paint Trump in a positive light is immediately labeled leftist propaganda, a term we'll return to shortly.
In 2018, that same CEO that you're talking about called the president in the Oval Office, who nearly 80 million Americans elected, she called him racist, shared a photo of herself wearing a Biden for President campaign hat, serves on the board of a Soros-funded activist group. In 2020, PBS's White House correspondent at the time characterized President Trump's speech then at Mount Rushmore as a love letter to white resentment, promoting the myth of America. In 2017, PBS devoted an entire panel talking about what it means to be woke and white privilege. In 2023, PBS's Washington Week Roundtable covered up Joe Biden's clear mental divide. That's actually quite the clip. I would encourage all of you to look at it. These are not honest news organizations. These are partisan, left-wing outlets that are funded by the taxpayers. And this administration does not believe it's a good use of the taxpayers' time and money. Democrats, there was a time in this country where Democrats too cared about getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in our federal spending. I think every American agrees the government spends way too much money on things that don't matter. Some of those things includes PBS and NPR.
Karoline Leavitt's gripes with NPR, they're not about journalistic standards or ethics. They are about discomfort. She and her party don't like when stories are told that don't flatter them or their leader. They don't like when journalists ask real questions or elevate marginalized voices. It's not that the reporting is wrong, it's that it's inconvenient. And for MAGA, that alone is enough to justify pulling the plug. You know, here's just some of what Leavitt's fellow party members in the House said earlier this year in the lead up to these funding cuts becoming official.
As we continue investigating waste, fraud, and abuse, and we can look no further than the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the LGBTQ indoctrination of our children, the systematic racism narrative, and the support for censorship being pushed by the heads of NPR and PBS are just several of the many abuses of taxpayer dollars. And if you are one of the select few who might support such content, you can personally support and fund it with your own money through private donations, because the reality is the United States of America is broke and can't afford it. And after all, PBS and NPR are already fundraising off of this committee hearing. I think from what we have heard here today, the American people will not continue to allow such propaganda to be funded through the federal government with their hard-earned tax dollars.
Today, in that same remote area, I mean, you've got Sirius XM, you've got podcasts, there's internet access now, there's a whole menu of media options now. I don't even recognize the station anymore. It's not news. I feel like it's propaganda. I feel like there's disinformation every time I listen to NPR. And, you know, a media entity like MSNBC or Huffington Post that, in my opinion, consistently spews disinformation. They can do that. They're a private company. But NPR gets federal funds. And you know, I have a problem with that.
Okay, well, in January, North County Public Radio, and that's a subsidiary of NPR, had Daphne Brooks, who apparently is a black feminism scholar, on its show where it was hosted by the host, Brittany Lewis, and it says, have you ever watched something on TV and thought, okay, now this is propaganda? Have you ever had that moment? To which Daphne Brooks replied, whenever I see Lee Greenwood singing Proud to be an American.
I believe that represents the individual we interviewed on air, not the position.
And
of
yet you
NPR.
say there's no bias on NPR.
That is not a
And
position
that
of
is not a
NPR.
biased statement, ma'am. That is not even both parties wrap themselves around this song every time there's a national conflict. Lee Greenwood sings it, and he does a beautiful job, but you say there is no bias in NPR.
That is that individual's opinion, and she, of course, is entitled to it, but that is not the position of NPR.
Ma'am, you said in your opening statement that you were going to be transformative, and I believe you failed to do that. Let me ask you, why did you call President Trump a fascist and a deranged racist sociopath in 2020?
Congressman, I appreciate the opportunity to address this. I regret those tweets. I would not tweet them again today. They represented a time where I was reflecting on something that I believe that the president had said rather than who he is. I don't presume that anyone is a racist.
You don't believe anyone is a racist?
I don't start by presuming anyone is a racist, sir.
Okay.
Are you aware of any Republicans, any registered Republicans in your newsroom?
I couldn't say registered, but I know we have conservatives in our newsroom, yes.
Okay, so the recent registration, when it was looked at, 87 Democrats and 0 Republicans registered.
I found that very concerning,
Yeah,
sir.
I would. Not even 40 to 30 or 50 to 20, 87 to 0. But it shouldn't be surprising when their own CEO says things like, I'm so done with late-stage capitalism, or calls the President of the United States a deranged racist sociopath, or that America's addicted to white supremacy. So billions have gone into both of your coffers over the last several decades. And I understand why Democrats on this committee are going to viciously and vehemently defend you all, because you become a propaganda wing of the Democratic Party. 67% of your viewers and listeners identify as Democrat, with only 12% conservative, and you become a sandbox for leftist propagandists to frolic on taxpayer dime and no more. And when you said in the beginning you're going to promote a symphony of ideological viewpoints, yeah, you do. If you're left-leaning, far left,
The gentleman's
or
time has
remarkably
expired.
Marxist, I yield back.
Let's be honest about these arguments. The Republicans pushing for these cuts claim they're saving taxpayers' money, but that's not the real motive. PBS and NPR receive pennies compared to the billions shoveled toward, well, corporations and defense contractors. These cuts are not about budgets. They're about silencing any source of information that doesn't kiss the MAGA ring. Public media informs, it educates, it levels the playing field. And that terrifies the people who profit from confusion.
70% of all of the funds that are at risk right now go directly to local stations across the country, often tribal areas, rural areas. 50%, these are areas that are exposed to extreme weather patterns, like tornadoes, for example, in Florida along the hurricane coast. Often at risk. We have seen estimates that as many as 80 stations could go dark, and almost all of these are stations that exist in these areas that otherwise have limited resources and limited access. And it was my view that NPR needed a strategy that was really focused on serving the nation. That is not an issue of partisan bias. That is about making sure that as our country continues to change, we remain relevant for all of the different lifestyles that Americans have across the nation, whether you work as a farmer, whether you work in a city. There are so many different experiences that this country has. We need to reflect all of that.
And the people hurt most by these cuts, they're not the ones in power. They're not the ones on Capitol Hill. It's rural Americans who rely on the radio for local coverage. It's families in poverty who lose free educational programming. It's seniors who depend on accessible news they can trust. This isn't just a line item on a spreadsheet. This is deliberate harm. Cutting PBS and NPR isn't about trimming fat. It's about starving the people who rely on the truth the most.